I'm Dan Edmunds, and this is a 2020 Hyundai Veloster N. It's a unique three-door vehicle with some pretty cool suspension underneath. Come with me as I take off the wheels and have a look. But before we get started, remember to click subscribe. Can't see much from here except this red brake caliper with a big N on it and a McPherson strut suspension that doesn't look that unusual. We'll have to turn the wheel and get in closer to see what's really going on. Like a regular Veloster, the N has a coil-over McPherson strut layout. Bolts to the aluminum knuckle in this case, and picks up an L-shaped lower control arm at the bottom. And you can see that the front bushing is pretty much in line with the ball joint. So the forward bushing takes lateral coring loads primarily, whereas the rear bushing, because this is an L shape, will take the rearward component of pothole strikes and the like, where the ball joint's being pushed towards the back of the car, and turn it through 90 degrees so that it pushes in on the rear bushing, which is specially shaped to absorb those impacts. The knuckle on the N is unique. The geometry of the lower ball joint and the steering have been altered to produce a zero scrub radius. And that is something that was worked out during testing at the Nurburgring with Hyundai Motor Germany, and they worked out this particular arrangement, which frankly you won't be able to see the differences here, but they do exist. And the goal was to improve steering direct feel. So what's the scrub radius? Well, you have to imagine a line from the top of the strut where it bolts to the structure of the car down through the center of the lower ball joint, and then extend that line to the ground. Before I took the tire off, I turned it back and forth, and you can see these circular marks that it left behind. Well, the center of that is where the steering axis comes to the ground, and it's right in the middle of the tire. So that means the scrub radius is 0. Now, if that circle was centered around a point here or here, the distance between that point and the middle of the tire would be the scrub radius. This car has electronically controlled suspension, which mainly is these dampers with this adjustable valve here that can add extra damping to the base tuning of the shock. Now it does this by using sensors. There's a G sensor, the steering angle sensor, and other sensors to decide what's best for the situation at hand. And it could make adjustments up to once every 10 milliseconds. This ring is actually quite important because its presence stiffens the joint between the strut and the car body and improves steering feel. If you took it off and just put these nuts on without it, you'd feel a difference. This car doesn't need an extra strut tower brace because of the way it's built. The struts are right near the base of the windshield, and there is a brace running underneath the plastic, and you can see it disappearing here off in the shadows, and it goes all the way over to the other side. So yeah, it already has a strut tower brace. The stabilizer bar, you can see, snakes forward from its position back behind that subframe strut. It's way back there. And then it connects through this linkage directly to the strut housing. So it has a 1-to-1 motion ratio with respect to wheel movement. The steering and the stabilizer bar run behind the engine and transmission assembly, which forms pretty much an impenetrable wall, which is why this vehicle has rear steering. Here you can see how rear-mounted steering leads to front-mounted brakes. they're almost always on opposite sides because there just isn't space for them both to be on the same side. You will see exceptions, but there are drawbacks to doing that, and it's very rare. In almost every case, the steering gets first choice and the brakes have to take what's left. These are 13.6-inch rotors, and that makes them 0.6 of an inch bigger than those on a regular Veloster. They're also thick and nicely ventilated and have a lot of heat capacity. The calipers are painted a familiar red, but these are not 4-piston fixed calipers. It's a single piston sliding caliper. But you know what? That works just fine as long as the weight of the car and the amount of heat capacity in the rotors is up to the task. Well, that about wraps it up for the front suspension of the Veloster N. But I think the rear is going to be even more interesting because in 2016 they made a big change back there. It used to be a simple twist beam that I didn't really care for, but now it's something completely different, and I think it transformed the car. And then the N has just taken that a little bit further. So let's check that out. But on the way, I think I'm going to put one of the wheels and tires on the scale and see what it weighs. This Veloster N has Pirelli P0s, and the size is 235/35 R19. Let's see what this bad boy weighs. $53.5 pounds. Not too bad considering the size. Wow, that's definitely not a twist beam rear suspension, and thank goodness for that. They changed to this multi-link a few years ago, and the car's been a whole lot better ever since. Let's get in closer and see if we can see what they've done, what kind of multi-link it is, and if there are any differences that the N has over the regular Veloster. From here we can see a really big trailing arm and one top link. And so far, this reminds me of the suspension I used to like in the back of the Ford Focus when it was at its peak. This piece confirms that this is a blade type multi-link suspension. This is a trailing arm, not a link, because it's bolted in 2 places. And that means it doesn't just define the fore-aft position of the hub, it also holds it in place rotationally because it has 2 mounting points. So this does the job of 2 links. So that means we're only going to see 3 more. Here's where the trailing arm attaches to the body. It's a really big bushing that gives it the volume needed to absorb the longitudinal component of pothole strikes and the like. Meanwhile, the lateral links can be rigid to deal with cornering loads and provide good handling. Because of the trailing arm, we only need 1 top link to define the camber angle at the top of the hub. And these bushings really only have to deal with lateral loads. No surprise that there's 2 links down here. The one on the right is much longer, and it's got the spring mounted to it and the stabilizer bar, and it handles all of the cornering loads pretty much. The shorter one to the front is the toe link, and it's got an eccentric on it that you can use to adjust static toe in, but also in a dynamic sense. Because it's shorter, it will swing through a tighter arc and pull the front of the tire inwards in long sweeping corners to add a stabilizing dose of roll understeer. Anyway, we're looking at the lower control arm. At the very far right end, you can just barely see the pivot bolts washer right there at the muffler. And then if you go along the length of the arm about halfway across, you'll see a little bolt where the stabilizer bar attaches. That's about 50% out, so let's call that a 0.5 motion ratio. Further out we get to the depression where the coil spring seat is. That's about 70% maybe. So 1 inch of wheel motion will do 0.7 inches of spring compression. And then further out we have the shock absorber, which looks maybe 85%, I'm guessing, so it's a little more efficient yet. So yeah, those are the motion ratios of the main components and how they attach to this lower link, which I'll call a lower arm because it's doing a lot of work. The rear bump stop is mounted at the top of the rear shock absorber. It's a good thing we're not seeing a coilover setup here, because if the spring were here, it would intrude on cargo space quite a bit. Where it is under the floor is out of the way. Of course, the rear shock is electronically controlled as well, just like the front, and it's got a similar valve that adds additional damping on top of the base damping that comes from the valve inside the shock body itself. The spring is actually longer than it appears in other shots, because from here you can see that it goes down into the lower arm and registers against the bottom surface. Meanwhile, just behind it, we can see the stabilizer bar, which has been pretty elusive thus far, but it's there. The N is more focused on performance, so even though the hard points of the suspension are the same, the bushing calibration, spring rate, and the damping force inside the shock and other changes will make the N handle that much sharper. What's nice about the blade style multilink is that all the components pretty much have their own duties and they don't overlap. The main trailing arm handles fore-aft location of the suspension and takes up all the torque reactions. And the three links, the two on the bottom and the one on the top, define the camber angle and the toe setting of the suspension. And they handle all of the lateral cornering loads. So yeah, it's pretty efficient and not very expensive, and the only requirement is that you have enough room to package the trailing arm, which isn't always the case. The N's rear rotors are bigger than those on a regular Veloster, just like we saw up front. These are 12.4 inches in diameter compared to 11.8. It's a single piston sliding rear caliper, ventilated rotor, which is nice to see, and a mechanical parking brake, wherein the cable pulls on the back of the caliper. Well, that about wraps it up for this close-up look at the suspension of the Hyundai Veloster N. Remember to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and why not leave a question or comment below, especially if you have a particular car you'd like to see. I can't always get them, but I sure as heck try. Anyway, until next time, thanks for watching.